Welcome to this YSL Report Builder tutorial. In this video we'll explain how to add a basic calculated field to your reports. We'll begin with a quick look at how to add a simple ad hoc expression to a table and explain how to use the expression builder to insert column names and operators. We'll then move on and explain why a calculated field has some advantages over an ad hoc expression, and explain how to use the results of that calculated field to display them in a table, to sort that table, and also to filter a dataset. At the end of the video, we'll also explain how you can add calculations to the underlying SQL query which populates your datasets, and explain a few of the advantages and disadvantages of that approach. So let's get started. I've started by creating a brand new blank report in Report Builder, and the first thing I need to do is create a connection to the YSL Movies database. Just a quick reminder that if you don't already have a copy of that database, you can use this video which we created to help you install it, and you'll find a link in that video's description to download the script to help you do that. Anyway, assuming you've already got the database installed, let's create a new data source in the report by right-clicking the Data Sources folder and choosing Add Data Source. I'll call this one Movies, and then we can choose to use an embedded connection in the report. It's going to use Microsoft SQL Server, of course. I'll click the build button rather than write out my connection string from scratch. I'll type in a reference to my instance of SQL Server, which is called SQL 2017 in my case. And then from the drop-down list towards the bottom of the dialog, I should be able to select the Movies database. Having done that, I can click OK, and OK again, and that's the data source created. Next, let's add a data set which will include the fields from which we'll calculate our new values. We can do this by right-clicking on the Movies data source and then choose Add Data Set. We can give the dataset a sensible name. I'll call this one Films. And then rather than writing out my query, I'll click the Query Designer button to help me build it. From the Tables folder, I'll select the Film table, and then from the Film table I'm going to include the title, the runtime minutes, the budget dollars, box office dollars, Oscar nominations and Oscar wins. I'm also going to include a few filters in this dataset. I'm going to click the Add Filter button first, and the first filter I'm going to add will be based on the budget dollars column, and I want to make sure that I select any film whose budget dollars is not null. I then want to do the same thing for the box office dollars column, so I'm going to select box office dollars in a new filter, and then set the operator to is not, and then the value to null. Finally, I want to make sure that I only include Oscar-nominated films in this list. So I can add one more filter. I can set the column or field name to Oscar nominations, and then I can set the operator to is more than, and then enter a value of 0 for the Oscar nominations. Having done that, I can click OK again, and there's my dataset created. Now let's add a table to display the columns we've selected. I'll begin by tidying up the report by removing this title placeholder, and then I can right-click in the page footer and choose to remove that. I'll then right-click into the body of the report and choose Insert Table, and then having dragged that up into the top left-hand corner, I can simply start assigning the columns in the order I've selected them, so title, runtime minutes, budget dollars. Once I've run out of columns, I can either right-click and choose to insert new ones, or even more simply, I can click and drag column names from my dataset and attach them to the right-hand side of the table. Once I've done this, I'm going to quickly just run the report to check that I can see all the things I expect to see. And as expected, I've encountered this little text display bug, which has been haunting me for the last few months with reporting services. A simple way to make sure that all the text appears, if I head back to the design view and then highlight all the cells in the table, if I simply change the font, pretty much any property of the font I think, but if I change the font name to a different font and then simply reselect the one that was already selected, if I head to the run option again, I should now see all the values from that table. Wonderful. So back into the design view, and now we can start thinking about how to add our calculated fields. The first calculation I'd like to add will work out the film's profit by subtracting its budget from its box office. There are several ways I could add that calculation in Report Builder. One simple way is to almost treat this table as a miniature Excel worksheet. If I wanted to have a new column to show the film's profit, I could click somewhere inside the table in the box office column, and then right-click on its header to choose Insert Column to the right. In Excel, I'd then just click into the cell and start typing my formula beginning with an equals operator. But that doesn't quite work in Reporting Services or Report Builder. What I need to do here is right-click into that empty cell and choose to view the expression builder, so I can click the FX button next to the word expression. The expression builder then shows me the equals operator, and I could begin just typing in my formula longhand, but it's much more convenient to use the list of options in the bottom left-hand corner to select the various components of this calculation. The first thing I need to do is refer to the value of the box office dollars field in the dataset. So if I find the field's category next to the name of the dataset, films, on the list on the right-hand side I can simply double-click box office dollars to insert a reference to its value. I could then manually type in the subtract symbol, or if I was feeling particularly lazy and couldn't be bothered taking my hand off the mouse, I even have a category of operators, and inside there is a subcategory called arithmetic. And if I select that, I could just then double-click the subtract operator to insert it into the expression. That's a bit of an extreme example, that one, of course, but it's nice to know what list of operators you have available so you can see all the operators in these various categories here. Now what I would like to do is insert a reference to the budget dollars field, so I can head back to the fields list next to the film's dataset, and then double-click budget dollars to complete the expression, and you should end up with something looking a little bit like this. Having done that, I can click OK to create my calculation, and to see the results, all I need to do is run the report and check that I see a list of numbers. I'm not going to do the mental arithmetic to check that that's correct. I'm just going to trust that it's doing the right thing. So that works. It's fairly easy to create, but there are a few downsides to it. First of all, I guess we don't get the column heading at the top, although that's a fairly simple thing to solve. We could just type in a column heading. Of more concern is how I would reference that value later on in the report. What if, for example, I wanted to sort this table so that the most profitable film appeared at the top of the list? I don't currently have an easy way to reference this value that I've created. So although ad hoc expressions that we've just created are fairly easy, they're not necessarily the best choice for writing calculations in a report. Rather than using an ad hoc expression then, we'll move on and create a proper calculated field in our film's dataset. I'm going to start by selecting the cell containing the expression I've created and hit the delete key to remove it. Then I'm going to right-click on the film's dataset name and choose to add a calculated field. I need to start by giving the field a new name, so I'm going to call this one, let's call it profit dollars. Don't include spaces in your field names. And then if I want to build the expression, I can once again just click on the FX symbol to launch the expression builder. The calculation is exactly the same, so let's head to the fields list, double click box office dollars. I'll type in the subtract symbol this time, and then simply double click budget dollars. Having done that, I can click OK a couple of times, and then my new field appears in the fields list of the dataset. This means that I can add it to visuals in the report by either clicking and dragging it into the visual, or I can even use the field selector in a table that will show a list of calculated columns alongside any query columns. So if I choose profit dollars, that will also automatically add the column header, which is nice. And if I then run the report, I'll end up with exactly the same results as I saw earlier, but with the added advantage that I can reuse this profit dollars column in multiple parts of the same report. Let's add a bit of basic formatting to our dollars columns just to make the values a little more readable. Ideally, I'd like to use the text box properties dialog box to do this for all three cells at the same time, but sadly I can't do that. If I select multiple text boxes, I can't view the properties dialog box. So what I'm going to do instead is format the first dollars value using the text box properties dialog box. So I can right click budget dollars and choose text box properties. I can then head to the number tab on the left hand side and choose the currency category. I'll reduce the decimal places to 0, and I'll also include the thousands separator. I then want to change the currency symbol used, so I'm currently using my regional settings, English United Kingdom. If I change this to US dollars, I can scroll upwards to find English or dollars English United States and select that and then click OK. Now, what I'd like to do is quickly copy that same format to the other two cells. One way to do this is to head to the View tab in the ribbon and view the Properties window. With the budget dollars column selected, or the budget dollars cell selected, I can scroll downwards in the Properties window to find the number format property. So this shows me the custom number format that I've created by using the dialog box. If you know the syntax of these well enough, you can just type these directly in. But if you wanted a bit of help, you can use the dialog box as I have just done, and then just copy and paste the custom number format. The advantage of the Properties window is that it remains visible no matter how many objects you've got selected. So if I select the other two dollars columns, box office and profit, I can scroll downwards and find the number format property, and then just paste in what I've just copied. Having done that, if I head back to the Home tab in the ribbon and then run the report again, I should now see a slightly more readable version of the same values. The next calculated field I'll create is going to divide the Oscar wins by Oscar nominations to work out the success rate. So to do that, let's right-click on the film's dataset and choose Add Calculated Field. I'll call the new field Success Rate, again without using spaces, then hit the FX button on the right-hand side to launch the expression builder. This is a fairly simple calculation again. I can head straight to the fields list, double-click Oscar wins, type in the /4 divided by, and then double-click Oscar nominations. So your end expression should look a little like this. If I then click OK a couple of times, and then I can drag this success rate field into my table and attach it to the right-hand side. If I then run the report, I will indeed see a result for each film. So currently it's been displayed as a decimal, of course, so this is the underlying value that I've just calculated as a decimal data type. Ideally, I'd like to format this as a percentage, so rather than 0.75, it'll say 75% instead. Let's head back to the design view, and again this is fairly easy to achieve. We've only got one column to format this time. So I can right-click Success Rate, I can use Text Box Properties, then I can head to the Number page on the dialog box, choose the Percentage category, use 2 decimal places, and then click OK. A quick run of the report, and that should look a lot neater at this stage. The final calculated field we'll create in this dataset is going to demonstrate that you can use an existing calculated field in a subsequent expression. So I'd like to work out how much profit our films made per minute. I'm going to do that by dividing the profit in dollars by the runtime in minutes. So I can right-click on the film's dataset and choose Add Calculated Field. I'll call this one Profit per Minute, and then click the FX button on the right-hand side to launch the expression builder. So if I head to the fields category for the film's dataset, because I've already added the profit dollars field to it, I can simply select that to refer to it in a new expression. I can then divide that by the runtime minutes, which is one of our original query columns, and then click OK, and OK again. I'll add that value, add that column into my table. I'll insert it just after the profit dollars, but before the Oscar nominations. And then I think I'd like to apply a bit of basic formatting to that. So let's see, I want to right click on that cell and choose Text Box Properties. Head to the Number tab in the dialog, choose Currency, and then I'll use decimal places this time. So I'm not going to use exactly the same format as the other 3 columns referring to dollars. I'll use the thousands separator, and I will change the currency symbol from English to dollars English United States. So having done that, I can click OK, and then a quick run of the report, and I should see a new value based on one of our existing calculated columns. So that's all fairly nice and straightforward. As well as simply displaying the results of your calculated columns in visuals in the report, you can also use them to do things like sorting and filtering. So for example, let's say I wanted to show the film with the highest profit per minute at the top of this table. If I select something inside the table to expose the grey boxes around the outside, I can then right click on one of those grey boxes and choose to view Tablix or Tablix properties. In the dialog box, I can then head to the sorting page. I can then click Add, and then I can choose to sort by any of the existing calculated columns in that dataset. So I'll go for profit per minute and choose Z to A order. If I click OK and then run the report, I'll see a slightly different list, and apparently Avatar has the highest profit per minute of any film in the dataset. I can also use the results of calculated columns to apply filtering to the table. So if I head back to the design view, rather than filtering the table this time, let's apply the filter to the film's dataset. If I right click on the dataset, I can choose dataset properties. Then I can head to the filters page and choose to add a filter. Now there is one thing you need to be slightly careful of when selecting calculated fields for a filter. If I start by selecting one of my built-in query fields, so let's say for example runtime minutes, you'll notice what happens to the data type that's selected on the right hand side. If I choose runtime minutes, the filter implicitly knows that that is an integer or a whole number. Again, if I changed to a different option, if I change to title, it knows that title is definitely text. Now that doesn't happen when you select a calculated column. If I head to the drop down list here and let's say I want to show any films with an Oscar success rate of at least 50%. If I choose the success rate field, the dialog box doesn't recognize the data type of that calculated column. So I have to make sure I select this myself. Now the success rate of Oscars is generated as a decimal value, or a float as it's referred to in this list of data types in Report Builder. So I need to make sure I select float, otherwise the filter simply won't work. I can then choose my operator. I'll go for greater than or equal to. And then for the value, make sure you refer to the underlying value that's calculated. So if you think back to what we saw the first time we added the success rate field to the table, that was shown as a decimal number. So a success rate of at least 50% would be 0.5. Having done that, I can click OK and then run the report just to have a quick look at the results, and I should now be seeing only films which have at least a 50% success rate. Okay, so there we go. For the final part of this video, I'd just like to quickly talk about some of the differences between adding calculated fields to a Report Builder dataset and adding expressions to the underlying SQL of your query which populates that dataset. To do this, I'm going to make a duplicate of the film's dataset first. I'm going to right click on it and choose Dataset Properties. Then I'm going to quickly copy the entire query from the query dialog or the query text box and then click OK. I'm then going to right click on the movie's data source and choose to add a new dataset. I'll call this new dataset Films 2. I can't think of any more inventive names than that at this point. And then paste in the query that I've just copied into that query text box. If I then click OK, I'll have essentially a version of the dataset that we started with before we added any calculated fields to it. Next, I'd like a new table which will display the results in the same way as my current table. So let's do a bit of copy paste here again. If I select that table and then choose Ctrl+C to copy, Ctrl+V to paste. Just because I don't have any calculated fields in this Films 2 dataset yet, I need to get rid of any existing calculated fields from the table. So let's get rid of profit dollars and profit per minute. I can highlight those two columns and then choose to delete them. Then also get rid of success rate there as well. I'll delete the success rate column. What I can then do is I'll also need to remove the sort from that table as well, so I can view the tablix or tablix properties, head to the sorting page and choose to remove the sort for profit per minute. While I've got the tablix properties dialog box open, I can head to the general page and then simply change the dataset which populates this table to Films 2. If I then click OK, I'll then close down the properties window to give myself a bit more space, and then I'm going to drag this new table over to the right hand side of the existing one, just so that eventually we'll be able to compare the rows side by side. So having done that, if I quickly run the report just to check that it works, there we go. So obviously the order of the films is different this time, and we're seeing a different number of films because of the filter that's applied to the original films dataset. But we've got the basics now to start adding some calculated fields, but added to the SQL of the underlying query. Let's recreate the profit dollars column in our new Films 2 dataset. If I right click on the Films 2 dataset and choose Dataset Properties, rather than adding a calculated field, I can simply write the SQL code required to calculate the correct value. Now, to do this in the query text box it's just a plain text box. You don't get any help with syntax checking or IntelliSense. You don't get the ability to insert column names, etc. You have to write everything longhand, as it were. If you prefer, you might like to use a tool such as SQL Server Management Studio. Write your query in that tool, which has all the fancy tools enabled, and then simply copy and paste your query text back into this dialog. For this simple example, I'm quite happy typing this one in, so if I just zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm doing, I can give myself a blank line in the select list and then add a new column starting with a comma. I could then just copy and paste the existing column names here, but let's just write this one out. I'm going to say film.boxoffice$, the case here isn't important, minus film.budget$. And then to give this an alias, I can say as, and then profit dollars. Okay, so having done that, I'll zoom back out, then click OK and find my new calculated column has been added to this query. If I drag profit dollars into my second table, I'll drop it next door to box office, so in between box office and Oscar nominations. I'd also like to format that cell in the same way as the budget and box office, so I can right click and choose text box properties, head to the number page, choose currency, 0 decimal places, 1000 separator, and then dollars English US for the currency symbol. If I then click OK and then preview the report or run it, I should see a new column of results. I'll just scroll along so we can read it more clearly, showing the result. So just as we'd expect, I suppose. The advantage of doing things this way is that there are performance advantages basically to writing your calculated columns in the dataset query rather than adding them as calculated fields later. Of course, the calculated fields that we've added to our dataset are still useful. You don't always get the option to write calculated columns in your SQL. For example, if you were using a store procedure as the basis of your dataset, you couldn't add any SQL to it. You simply select the store procedure's name from the list there. So calculated columns or calculated fields are still useful, but if you have the choice, it's probably better to do it in the underlying SQL query. There are a few things that are slightly more awkward to do in SQL compared to basic calculated fields in Report Builder datasets, which may mean you lean slightly more towards the easy way of doing things. Let's show you a quick example. I want to recreate the success rate column that we created earlier, but in SQL this time. So let's right click on the Films to dataset and choose dataset properties. And then I can create a new column. I'll zoom in again so that hopefully you can see what I'm doing. And then if I add in a new calculation, which will be film.oscarwins divided by film.oscar nominations. I'll give this a quick alias as success rate, so we've got consistency in our column names. Having done that, I'll click OK, and then I can add that new column to my table if I right click to insert a new column to the right, and then I can simply select this one using the field selector, success rate. I'll just apply the basic percentage formatting to this text box as well, so I can right click, text box properties, head to the number page, choose percentage, with 2 decimal places. If I then click OK and then run the report, if I scroll along to the right hand side, although I can clearly see that I've calculated some values, the answers aren't quite exactly as you'd expect. So for Jurassic Park, actually, that's correct. 3 divided by 3 is 1 or 100%. For Spider-Man as well, that's correct. 0 divided by 2 is 0. But for things like King Kong, 3 divided by 4 should be coming out as 75%, and that's clearly not the case. So the problem with writing our calculation in SQL is that the expression has to follow all the rules of SQL, and one of the main rules it has to follow are those to do with data type precedence. In SQL, if I create a calculation which all the values have the same data type, so for example Oscar nominations and Oscar wins are both whole numbers, both integers. If I divide one integer by another integer in SQL, the result will also be an integer, so it must be a whole number. So the only 2 possibilities here are either 0 or 1. That's clearly different with our calculated field that we added to our dataset earlier. Clearly there's some kind of implicit conversion going on to convert our whole number data types into decimal values. If we want to achieve the same thing in SQL, we have to explicitly convert our data types. So just to show you how to do that, if I go back to the design view and then right-click the Films to Dataset and choose Dataset Properties. If I zoom in a little bit so we can see what's going on, let's see. Technically, we only need to change one of the data types of either Oscar nominations or Oscar wins into a decimal type. Because of the data type precedence rules, all decimal types are more important than whole number types or integer types. I'll make sure that I've converted or cast both of my Oscar wins and Oscar nominations into the float data type. So I can do this by passing the Oscar wins field first into the cast function. So I can say cast followed by open some parentheses, and then at the end of the field name I can say as, and then the data type I want to use. So in this case I'll go with float. I'll do the same thing for Oscar nominations. I can say cast film.Oscar nominations as float, and then close the parentheses as success rate. I can then click OK, and having done that, I can run the report and see, hopefully, at the end, there we go, we've got the correct values now being calculated. Another thing that was easy to do with our calculated field in a dataset was to refer to an existing calculation, for example, for our profit per minute expression. That's not quite so easy to do in an SQL query. Let's see how we can do it. If I switch back to the design view and then go back to the dataset properties for Films 2, I now want to add in a new calculated column at the end of my select list. If I zoom in again so we can see a little more clearly what I'm doing, I'll add a new column. And the first thing I'd like to do here is refer to the profit dollars value. I want to divide profit dollars by runtime minutes. Now, although I've created that expression and given it a name, profit dollars, I can't reference this in the same select list. So if I wanted to replicate or use the result of that calculation, I have to write that one out again. So I'm going to open some parentheses and say film.boxoffice dollars. Again, of course, I could just copy and paste this. And then I'll say minus film.budget dollars. I'll spell that correctly. And then I will divide that by film.runtime minutes. Now, another thing we have to consider here is the fact that box office, budget, and runtime are all integer fields. So the result of this calculation will also be an integer or a whole number. To make sure that I get a decimal result, I need to make sure that at least one of these values is a decimal type or a float, something like that. So just for convenience here, I'm going to make sure that I've cast film.runtime minutes as float. I can then give that column an alias. I can say as, and then I'll call this profit per minute. So I can achieve the same result. It's just a lot more awkward to write, and you have to know your SQL syntax quite well in order to make that work. So assuming that I do know my syntax well enough, I click OK, and then I can add my profit per minute column to my table. I'll drop that in just after profit dollars. And then if I were to run the report, I'll hopefully find that I get my profit per minute calculation working there properly. It could do with a bit of tidying up with formatting, and then I could apply the sorting and the filtering as I've done previously. So that all works in the same way. If I head back to the design view, I can sort this new table now by its profit per minute field. So I can add a sort by profit per minute, and I'll go Z to A, so a descending order again. And I can also add a filter to this dataset. If I right click on the Films 2 dataset and choose Dataset Properties, if I head to the Filters page, I can click Add and then choose to filter this for the profit per minute. Oh, beg your pardon, now let's go with the success rate. One of the nice things about using SQL calculations in the underlying query is that the data types will be detected for you automatically. So if I go for greater than or equal to 0.5, I can then click OK and then run the report one more time. And apart from the formatting that I could apply to the profit per minute column, the results here are the same now as we saw for the calculated fields that we added to our dataset earlier. So there we go, some basic techniques for adding new calculated values to your report builder datasets. Just to quickly summarise, you can add a calculated field to a dataset using Report Builder's expression builder, and this has the advantage of allowing you to insert column names and operators, etc., so they're slightly easier to create. You can also add a calculated field no matter how you've created your dataset, so whether it's been populated with a simple ad hoc query, such as this one, or whether it's been populated with a stored procedure, you can still add a calculated field to it. You can also add expressions to the underlying SQL query of a dataset, and these are slightly more difficult to create. You have to know your SQL syntax quite well, but they do have the benefit of better performance. One other downside is that you can't always add these query expressions to your datasets. For example, if you've chosen a stored procedure, you don't get the option to add a calculation in your underlying SQL query. So in your report builder career, you'll probably use both techniques from time to time. I guess it's a case of picking which one suits the job best. Hopefully this video gives you a bit of an overview of what the differences are so you can make the best choice. Thanks for watching. See you next time.